tonight. I knew it was going to be a lot of people turned out, and I didn't want to scare her, so I didn't tell her. And yes, I am currently serving as a commissioner on the Texas Historical Commission, and I do live here full-time in Rockport, so if I can help you with anything, let me know. Before I go any further, I just do want to thank the History Center and the Historical Society for letting us tell our family history. It's really amazing. I'm so honored to introduce tonight's speaker. She not only also serves as a commissioner on the Texas Historical Commission, she's also my second cousin. Therefore, the subject of tonight's presentation, Francisco Yturria, is great-great-grandfather to both of us. And I'm also very pleased to tell you that her parents are with us tonight, Dr. and Mrs. Martin Garcia. Wave. And Dr. Garcia is the great-grandson of Francisco Yturria. And there is yet another descendant of Francisco Yturria in the house, my sister Vicki Adkins, and her husband have also joined us tonight. Our presenter tonight, who was appointed to the Texas Historical Commission by Governor Abbott in 2018, was born in Raymondville, Texas, and is a fifth-generation rancher and descendant of Francisco Yturria. So important was Francisco Yturria to Texas history that our speaker made him the subject of her graduate research and thesis. Our presenter received a Master's of Arts in History at Southern Methodist University in Dallas under the tutelage of Dr. David Weber, a world-renowned historian of U.S. borderlands. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science in Ibero-American Studies from SMU. Currently a professor of history at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, she has also lectured at UT Brownsville / Texas Southmost College and taught at St. Joseph's Academy in Brownsville. Her love of art led her to study abroad. She has lived in Spain and England and has achieved advanced studies in art history from Sotheby's Institute in London. In addition, she worked at Christie's Auction House in New York City. Currently, she serves on the board of directors of the Camille Playhouse in Brownsville and serves on the advisory board of the Museum of South Texas History in Edinburgh. She has served on various other boards and is a member of numerous historical and art museums and associations. Her work has been published, and she is currently doing research on her family's history in South Texas, of course focusing on our patriarch, Francisco Yturria, for a future book. I present to you tonight's speaker, Commissioner Lilia Garcia.
Well, thank you, Rockport. Thank you, everybody here. I'm just going to power up really quick while I start. I'm a professor. You get so used to PowerPoints and lectures and your little podium and everything. And the moment you have to do without it, you're like, oh my gosh, I can't. So I'll go ahead. These are for my notes. Like I tell my students, it's like, the PowerPoint is for me. You all need to listen to the lecture. I get kind of sidetracked and lost somewhere in the lectures. Yes, I first want to say thank you to the Aransas County Historical Society, and I want to thank also the the Friends of the History Center, and of course I want to acknowledge the descendants of Francisco that are here, as well as other distinguished guests, and just thank you all. I am very humbled by you all coming here. It's a beautiful showing for someone that I actually have a lot of love for, and I never knew him. He is my great-great-grandfather, but he is someone that, because of his very wise choices and very focused mind, we have had 6, 7 generations being able to profit from that. And a lot of the lands, I would say probably about 95% of the old Yturria lands are still within holds or being held by family members. So although it wasn't incorporated like the King Ranch or something like that, there is a great legacy that he left upon the family to maintain and care for something that he worked very, very hard for. So who is Francisco Yturria, you may ask? We've heard of Mifflin Kennedy, we've heard of Richard King, you all may have even heard of Charles Stillman, who is considered to be the father or founder of Brownsville. Francisco Yturria was a contemporary. He was right there with them. But what is more unusual for this whole period is that Francisco was born in Mexico. And so you're looking at a Hispanic who in 1848 actually comes to the northern part of Rio Grande. But the idea is, at a time when Hispanics, it's very often talked about that after the Mexican-American War, and I won't be a professor and tell you the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo said that, we won't go there, I'll just say, basically, there was a lot of problems later with Mexican landholders who lost a lot of their lands after the Mexican-American War. Well, Francisco doesn't fit with that mold. And partly because of all the great stories I heard about growing up on a ranch, being on the very lands that he had purchased. And I don't know if he had actually been on that part of the land that I was living on, but I kind of imagined him being there. I was always fascinated. Who was this man? And again, I went off to college and I heard all these stories about Hispanics losing and Hispanics losing power, and they did. I'm not going to be controversial or anything, but he did it. So what made him unique and special? What or who was he? To begin with, I always say Francisco Yturria was a merchant banker, and that is exactly what he probably would have told you. If you asked him, who is he, what does he do? He said, I'm a merchant and I'm a banker. And he loved being a merchant. He was an entrepreneur. And that is really interesting during a very interesting era, the Gilded Age, when entrepreneurship all over the United States is being catapulted to stratospheric heights with people like Rockefeller and Carnegie. Well, the thing that's really interesting about Francisco Yturria is that you see him in the same exact era, very much being like them. He was a cattle baron, sort of. The family likes to make him out as this big cattle baron. Francisco wanted to be a city guy. He was a banker. He was a merchant. But he did invest in ranches, especially after the Civil War when you have the great cattle boom. He was a railroad investor. You all were talking about your railroad symposium coming up, which is fascinating because we'll be talking very briefly about one of those little railroads, the St. Louis-Brownsville, Mexico Railroad. Well, Francisco was on its board of directors. He was very instrumental in getting it to Brownsville. Well, I'm sure you all are from South Texas, know how important the railroad was and how it opened up and actually transformed the Rio Grande Valley, because it did make it agricultural, whereas before it had been more ranching and even more into merchant and trading. But after that railroad, things forever changed. He was a South Texas legend. He was intertwined with the land around him. He was a product of northern Mexico. He lived in southern Texas, and he very much straddled the Rio Grande. He shaped the land around him, but you know what? The land shaped him. He was as much a part of the land as he was instrumentally changing the land. He was very, and perhaps his most famous thing, and probably what family talked about the most, was also a smuggler. Now, before we start thinking narcos and all that kind of stuff, that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is Confederate cotton. As you all know, Texas was a Confederate state. And in 1861, when the Union blockaded a great chunk of the Confederate ports, well, Francisco, able to use a lot of Mexican connections, and I'll explain them, does a very creative smuggling, and becomes one of the leading cotton brokers in South Texas. It is because of that creative smuggling, surprise, surprise, smuggling in South Texas, but because of that, he was able to amass not only a fortune in gold and in cash, but also increase his land holdings. This is a young man, later old, but a young man that not only was in step with people like Stillman and Richard King of the King Ranch and Mifflin Kennedy, Jose San Roman of the very old Spanish family of Brownsville, but he is so intertwined with South Texas. When you see the old Yturria accounting books, the people that he was doing business with, if you're ever in South Texas, in Brownsville, and you see the names on the buildings, the Putinets, the Treviños, the Garzas, and yes, there's always a lot of different Garzas and Garcias, I'm one of them. But you see these old families, and they're all doing business with Francisco. And we also see a lot of business coming from Rockport, from Corpus Christi, from a lot of other areas. I always like to say that Francisco had an eye for talent. The same way that he was the little protege of Charles Stillman at 12 years old. Well, he had an eye for talent, and one of the people that he actually hired as his young clerk and accountant was a man by the name of Ignacio Garza. Ignacio Garza, a Hispanic family in South Texas, will go on to educate pretty much all of his family. His oldest son, I believe, was Reynaldo Garza. The reason I mention Reynaldo Garza is a very, very special name in South Texas. He was the first ever Hispanic federal judge appointed by Lyndon B. Johnson in the 1960s. He was later appointed to the New Orleans Circuit of Appeals, again, one of the highest ranking Hispanic federal judges, and he was on the short list twice by presidents of the United States to be in the Supreme Court. One by, I believe, President Carter, the other by either President Bush or President Reagan. But I always say Francisco was probably involved in that somehow. Anyway, Francisco was born in 1830 and died in 1912. He was the son of a career military officer. Not a lot of money, perhaps a little bit of prestige because he was involved, Colonel Manuel Maria Espada was involved in the military, but Francisco did not have the name, did not have the land. When he died in 1912, he was worth over $1 million, and this is $1 million in 1912 times. It was also money that he had in banks. He also had gold, and he had amassed over 150,000 acres in South Texas. It surpassed 4 to 5 counties. He is very much like his contemporaries of Captain King and Captain Kennedy. I always say it was pretty good for a military brat. He was born in 1830, and if y'all know a little bit of Texas history, 1836, Texas declares its independence from Mexico. Francisco is in Matamoros. He was born in Matamoros. Well, we think, I'll get to that in a little bit. But he was born on the southern bank of the Rio Grande, and he is seeing, 6 years old, he is seeing the Texas Revolution. He is seeing the independence of Texas. He is seeing the Mexican-American War, when Texas gets annexed in the Mexican-American War. He lived through the Civil War, lived through Reconstruction, the Gilded Age, the cattle boom. He lived through bandit raids, ethnic tensions, technological advances, the telephone, the cash registers, electricity, and the railroad. And if you want to know why I mentioned the cash registers, because Francisco is about money, he is about making it, and cash registers were probably one of the first things he really, really wanted in his store. He also survived 3 assassination attempts. Success sometimes does breed a bit of envy. He grew up on the Rio Grande Delta, changed banks from the south to the north. He spoke 3 languages: Spanish, English, and French. He was a power broker, a man that could deal with Mexican power holders on the Matamoros side and American power holders on the Brownsville side. He interacted with all the same. It was the perfect balance for South Texas because he's Hispanic. He also admired very much the Anglo-American way of making money, business. He really is that bridge for South Texas. He is South Texas. He Americanized the economy of South Texas, brought in the Yankee way of thinking, but he also bridged the old Hispanic culture. And so what you see is a man that is very much able to have a vision and work towards that, but at the same time retain a lot of the local culture so that the people in the local area still trust him. They still believe in him. I also say, and I mentioned this earlier, that one of the things that struck me when I was doing a lot of research is that Francisco was a lot like the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts and all those other Gilded Age entrepreneurs. He believed in hard work, getting to the store as early as possible before anybody else was there. He left late, and even when he was already getting older and tireder and sicker, he was like, give me the books, I want to look at them. He constantly micromanaged everything. He was disciplined and focused and definitely a numbers man. He believed in family, but he had had a hard life. His mother died when he was young. He was an immigrant, like Carnegie, and many other of these great stories of the Gilded Age. But more than anything, what I always say is that he was a visionary. What he saw, even at 12 years old, working under Charles Stillman in Mount Morris, was a way of doing business that he realized he wanted to be part of, and how he could bring that business, using what he knew from Matamoros, and bring it to the northern banks, to the new Brownsville site. And he realized that since he was this bridge between Brownsville and Matamoros, he could profit from that. I'll give you a quick example of how Francisco was able to profit from this, is that he had 2 merchant houses, one in Matamoros, one in Brownsville. He put his brother in charge of the one in Matamoros. But I always heard story, and he actually, speaking of technology, I do like to say this story. Francisco was the first person, I think, in the country to have the first international telephone line. He actually put together a telephone across the Rio Grande telephone line that connected his Brownsville merchant house to the Matamoros merchant house. And it only worked for those 2 stores, but it is the first truly international phone line. But one of the things that I really found fascinating about Francisco, and I'll talk about his business, is that for you all to keep in mind that this man, actually, when he did business, could be quite quiet, observant. He loved not letting people know that he spoke one or the other language. He liked it when people thought he only spoke Spanish, or that he only spoke English, or French, or whatever it was, because it would give him a leg up, an advantage. So, I think that's already giving you a little bit of an idea of who Francisco was. He was very crafty and very cunning sometimes. Anyhow, he was born October 4th, 1830, on the feast of St. Francis, hence the name Francisco. He died June 15th, 1812, of complications from diabetes and circulation issues. In fact, I probably should add, as he got older, he loved the grand life. He loved food. And he really fell in love with Southern food. And so he had his own cook, his own chef. His wife had her own chef, and she liked Mexican cooking, traditional Mexican cooking, and he loved Southern cooking. And so his chef, who I believe came from Louisiana, specialized in all kinds of really good Cajun, Southern, very fattening food. Well, that ended up hurting him, unfortunately. He did develop diabetes and circulation issues, and his physician, who was based out of New Orleans, out of the Loyola School of Medicine, I believe, Dr. Mata, suggested that really he could live longer if he amputated his leg. Francisco said, no, not going to happen. I'd rather have the few months I have left standing on my own 2 legs than be without it. He married Felicitas Trevino. She was a descendant of an old Spanish land grant family. She herself never received the Spanish land grant, but she was a descendant of a family that had had old Spanish land grants, and he will have 2 children. He will adopt 2 children. Daniel, his son, and Isabel, his daughter. There was a 17-year age difference between the 2. Daniel was treated very differently than little Isabel, because mainly they were adopted in different eras of Francisco's lives. Isabel, who was much more doting, while Daniel, who was a little bit more disciplined. You must do these things. I am a descendant of Isabel, on the Isabel side. But regardless, if you are a descendant of the Daniel Yturria side or Isabel Yturria de Garcia side, we still all call Francisco the patriarch and still all profit from everything he did. His mother was Paula Navarro from Palafox, Mexico. She died in 1842 when he was about 12 years old. His father, who had a big imprint on his life, was Colonel Manuel Maria. Colonel Manuel Maria Yturria was a Mexican soldier of Spanish descent. He actually taken an oath of loyalty to Mexico around 1821. His father had been a Spanish soldier, Sergeant Francisco, which is where Francisco got his name. What's really interesting about Colonel Manuel Maria is that he was the military aide to General Mier y Terán. I don't know if y'all know your Texas history, but the Mier y Terán report was one of the big reports that Texas, the Texans in Texas weren't obeying the Mexican rules and kind of paved the way, as you see later, for the Texas independence movement. Anyhow, he was one of his military aides. Francisco will have all younger siblings, 2 younger brothers and a younger sister, Santiago, Maria del Refugio, and Bernardo. He will outlive all of them except for his sister, who they call Tia Juga. Sorry, not Gugu. Anyhow, little Francisco grew up in Matamoros, and I don't know if y'all been in Matamoros lately. Matamoros back in the 1830s was a very international city. Not huge, but it was a thriving little trading center, kind of this idea that it would someday become the opening for trade in northern Mexico. Well, Colonel Manuel Maria had been stationed there with General Mier y Terán, and he had actually been given a real important post. He was head of the customs house. This was a really, really big deal. He did with all the trade that was coming off the port of Brazos de Santiago, which was actually the port that they used in Matamoros, that happened to be on the northern bank of the Rio Grande. Anyhow, it is through this contact, he's the customs guy, that Colonel Manuel Maria probably meets the most influential person on Francisco, Charles Stillman. Charles Stillman was from the north, from New York, a Yankee who was trading in Matamoros and had made his base in Matamoros and was being very, very profitable. Manuel Maria gets little Francisco to be his clerk, and you can pretty much say that Stillman takes him under his wings and it becomes his little protege. So from 12 years old on, little Francisco is seeing how the merchant business is working. And in the meantime, he's actually making contacts. He's making contacts with the New Orleans trade area, the wholesalers. He's making contact with people in New York. I mean, he's taking everything in, being very observant. He is learning English, he is learning numbers, he is learning customer service. And he sees in Stillman ingenuity, business. So you have this little kid who's already like, this is what I want to be. This is what I want. We need business, we need stability. He's not thinking of military like his dad, he's thinking this. In 1845, when Texas is annexed by the United States, you all know, Mexico is like, no, Texas is like, yes, there's an issue with the border. Mexico says it's the Nueces River, so technically we would be in Mexico right now, right? The Nueces River is just north. Okay, so we're, okay. And Texas said it was the Rio Grande. Fast forward, Mexican-American War. 1846 to 1848. So Francisco's 16 years old. His father has orders, he is sent, he has to go and do things. And he basically tells Charles Stillman, I have my 3 sons, I've got my daughter, you look after them. And he does. And there's a lot of big relationship between the Stillmans and the Yturrias. He will send Santiago and Bernardo to boarding school. He looks after the little sister, but Francisco is his numbers guy. And what you're seeing is that this is where it gets really kind of tragic for Francisco. He's already lost his mother. But his dad, after the Mexican-American War, is very anti-American. And he's very angry about the repercussions of the Mexican-American War. Francisco, in 1848, decides his future is not in Mexico. His future is with the new town site of Brownsville, which is being built just across the river from Matamoros, just the northern bank. If you live down there, then you're kind of like, it's just a hop, skip, and a jump. It's no big deal. When we think of it, it's an international border, and like, oh my God. But it wasn't back then. Brownsville, Matamoros, they still are very intertwined. But anyway, Francisco's like, this is my future. Charles Stillman is making the town. He is organizing it. This is where my future is. Mexico, and he had experienced this, constant revolutions, constant instability. He's like, I need to be where there's a stable environment. Why business? And so that's what you see him. You see him like, I'm going over there. Well, this does not sit well with his father. We also know that at some point, Manuel Maria, his dad, will remarry. and goes on to have another family. All we know is that basically, as of 1846, that's the last he ever talks to his dad. We will never see Manuel Maria again in the picture, nor with the younger siblings. So he's kind of this young kid. He's a young kid on the make. 18 years old, now on this new town on the northern bank of the Rio Grande. The 1850 U.S. Census has Francisco living in a house owned by Jules Curie. It was a French merchant. And it's really funny, so don't always trust the census when you look at them. They actually put Francisco Yturria, 20 years old, and they say he is French. which leads us to believe that he probably spoke very fluent French, because the census guy said he was French, and so Francisco probably loving it, going, yes, I am French. Anyhow, it is also in the early 1850s that we do know that Francisco is starting to get into business, not as Stillman's protege, but as a competitor to Stillman. And it's not being done in a bad way. There's no bad blood. It's just natural progression. Time for this guy to flap his own wings. And he does. He will start Yturria and Brothers. He's going to go into business kind of with his brothers. Sometimes it was F. Yturria and Brothers, and sometimes it was F. Yturria. But the brothers were always there. It just kind of, I think, depended on how Francisco was managing at that time. In 1851, Francisco will buy his first plot of land, 11th and Jefferson, and it is there that he will, in 1852, put his first merchant venture, his first kind of retail, wholesale merchant business. But, and this is where I'm family, but I'm also a historian. So when I got to work with all the Yturria archives, I got to see a lot of things, and I interpret things as a historian, not with the family folklore. And family was always like, he started working in the 1850s, and I'm like, I saw the letters, 1848, when he's 18, he's already selling things to various people in Rio Grande. And I saw the letters, and they're like, you're wrong. I'm like, okay, I guess I didn't see the letters. Anyhow, 1853, a big year for Francisco. He marries Felicitas Trevino. Great little story how they met. They met in the traditional Mexican custom, kind of like a paseo en la plaza. He's going one way on the plaza, and she's going the other way, and I guess their eyes met and it was love at first sight. I don't know. But they do end up married in 1853. What is really interesting, though, and this is where the cynic historian in me comes in, Felicitas is from an old land-holding family. She is part of what you would call the landed gentry. Francisco is a merchant. He is a son of the military officer. Yes, he may have had a little bit of prestige because of that, and yes, he does have some Spanish blood, which might have given him a little more prestige, a little more upper level on the hierarchy, but he's not landed gentry. And in Mexican and Hispanic culture, the same as it is in Southern culture, it is who your name is and what lands you have, and how long have those lands been in your family. That's what makes you a don, okay, a title, someone, landed gentry. Well, Francisco doesn't have that, but he is marrying into it. So it is actually through his wife that we will start seeing this very big push now to start acquiring lands. His wife will have her own inheritance from the old land grant. And what he's going to start doing is buying out a lot of her cousins and a lot of her relatives, so that by 1860, he has amassed over 5,000 acres related to this particular land grant. So it's kind of like he's got the cash, she's got the land. And a nice little way of coming in between. By 1856, he becomes a naturalized U.S. citizen. He makes sure, though, that his brothers keep their Mexican citizenship. So it's really interesting. He's already thinking, international border, I'll be the U.S. citizen. My brothers will run the stuff in Matamoros, particularly Santiago. Santiago was his right-hand man, his younger brother. And what they end up doing is like, you're going to be the Mexican citizen. And that way, depending on what the winds blow as far as politics, we can go back and forth. Because as far as we're concerned, this is one little venture, but really it's kind of two little ventures happening at the same time. By 1860, as I said, he has amassed over 5,000 acres in 2 counties. the San Martin Grant in Cameron County, and Porcion 97 in Cigar County. He had made a name for himself by 1860 with customer service, dealing with haughty customers, dealing with bratty customers. You see it in the letters where like the champagne or whatever we bought from you was not good. It did not make it up the river. And he's just like, it's okay, I'll give you something else. He didn't like to give money back, but he would give you. He also gets involved in hides and silver. He also buys a lumber yard. And it is through all these business deals that we're going to see him establish, and probably through the connection of Stillman himself, becoming very good friends with a man by the name of Captain Richard King and another one by the name of Mifflin. Mifflin being the older, I should have named him first. They were steamboat captains that had come down to the Rio Grande and basically hauled stuff up and down the Rio Grande. And they would have used, or Francisco would have used their services. They actually became close. And later, and what we're going to see after the Civil War, Francisco will be the banker at times for the King Ranch. So a very long connection there, long established. But it's his merchant business. And it's almost a natural progression from being a merchant to becoming a banker. Now, in 1848, I believe there had been a bank, I want to get it right, oh, I'm going to get it wrong. It's the Bank of Galveston Commercial and Loan or something of that sort. It had left the area. And so in essence, there was no bank. And what you're going to see throughout the 1850s is that Francisco is working as a banker. Not in the big way that we think of as a banker, but it's being like a merchant, loaning out money. But he really is the only banking institution south of San Antonio. I hate to tell you that, Corpus, in the Corpus area, it was the only sole banking institution really going into the 1860s and 1870s. But what we really see, and I really want to emphasize this, is that as Francisco, he is an American, but he is very close to his Mexican culture and obviously to his Mexican brothers and his Mexican business. What we're really seeing is that he knows all the power holders on the Brownsville side. In fact, he was involved politically with a group called the Reds, which were kind of the old Democrats in the 1850s. We're going to see that by his later in life, by the 1890s, he's actually become more of a Republican. But the reason he's involved in all this, knowing all these people, again, business. I'm going to make sure I have all the right contacts. But it works out really well for him because a lot of the Mexican families that may not have trusted this new Anglo power holders, they trust Francisco. Francisco can be the broker for them. And Francisco is going to be the guy they're going to go to. Francisco is that bridge, again. And in the process, Francisco is making quite a lot of money doing this. He will have employed his family, particularly his two brothers, but he will go on later, as you see in the 1870s and 1880s, taking really, really good care of his family. He also has as his right-hand man, one of his cousins from his wife's side, Rafael Aldrate, who was a big pawnbroker. Anyhow, he'll be involved with various kind of revolutionary activity on the border. He will support a guy by the name of Jose Maria Carvajal, who was a filibuster and was trying to establish an early free trade zone on the Rio Grande Delta. And if you're wondering why he would be interested in that, again, it's about money, stability. He will, in the way, make quite an amount of enemies, loans that he would call in, or perhaps maybe being too close to certain power holders that others thought they or just didn't like. 3 assassination attempts, one prior to the Civil War, one during the Civil War, and another one after. He will be involved politically. He, in 1861, will be elected county treasurer. But you all are interested in the biggies, the interesting stuff, and that is the Civil War. It's also called down in South Texas the years of los algodones, or the cotton years. It's really interesting. In 1861, there's a letter coming from a Confederate sympathizer by the name of P. Dowd, who actually, I believe, was in this area. And he was writing to Francisco to tell him, you know, I'm shocked how you're reacting about the dissolution of the Union. Because apparently, you infer from the letter that Francisco was actually very saddened that the Union had basically been divided and that these states had seceded. You have to remember, he was just naturalized in 1856, and he had a great love for the United States. This is where he saw his business future. And so for him, it just was like breaking his heart. He didn't own slaves. He never owned slaves. His cousin, Rafael Andrete, did, but he didn't. He had no interest in owning slaves. You also have to think that he probably was thinking this is going to be really bad for business. So he's not happy. But ironically, these years of the Civil War are going to be his most profitable years. So what ends up happening in the Civil War, and I kind of already gave you the spoiler alert earlier. As you all know, the Confederates, they have to sell their cotton. That's really the only way they're going to get their guns and the only way they're going to get their stuff. And so the cotton trade is extremely important to the Confederacy, but the Union has blockaded all their ports. Enter Brownsville, Matamoros. Little area that kind of people had forgotten probably, but this little area where the people just kind of came across the river back and forth with no issues, no problems, and it was all just kind of one little area. Well, Francisco and a bunch of other people, including Mifflin Kennedy and Richard King, are going to realize we need to start buying cotton. And we're going to bring it down from New Orleans, from Houston, all through this area. You'll see Aransas passed in a lot of the letters. You'll see Corpus Christi mentioned in a lot of these letters. And they're buying bales and bales and bales of cotton. And what they're doing is very simply, the Union is blockading the Brazos-Santiago port, which is on the northern bank. What they're simply doing is, thank you, Santiago. Remember his brother that he had kept on the Mexican side. He said, we're going to use the Yturria house on the Mexican side, Santiago, and what we're going to do is register everything under Santiago's name. He's a Mexican citizen. The United States, the Union ships cannot board a Mexican ship. And all the cotton will simply go out that way. They can't. In fact, what's really funny is you'll see in the U.S. consular reports, because there was a consulate in Matamoros, and they're talking, I mean, they actually, you'll see in the actual reports back to Washington, we know they're trading cotton, we know they're smuggling it, we know they're doing all this kind of stuff, especially when they actually mention Francisco's name. And so we know Francisco Yturria is using his Mexican brothers, but we can't do anything. What's really interesting, and a lot of people don't realize, is that the Civil War also coincides by some years with something that happens in Mexico, the French imperialist war. The French had taken over Mexico. Mexico was fighting for its independence. And so all of a sudden, you've got French, Mexican versus Union, Confederate. I mean, it's just a big hodgepodge of craziness going down in the valley. What Francisco is going to realize very quickly is, wait, people need guns. I got money. I can buy guns, and I will sell them. And he is. He's selling them to the French troops. Francisco did not support the Mexican movement in the French imperialist war. He supported the French. If you want to know why, I discussed it with other historians, Dr. Gilberto Hinojosa from UT, actually Carnegie University, sorry, who actually organized all the Yturria archives when I was doing my research, and he said, it's really interesting that he didn't support the Mexicans in the Mexican independence war, but if you think about it, to him, the French offered stability. They offered a stable economic environment, and that's what he needs. And so he supports the French. To the point that actually one of the times that Matamoros gets invaded by the Mexican rebel forces against the French government, he actually puts together a little militia and fights against them and gets knighted by Maximilian, the Emperor of Mexico. So, lots of money being made. We hear reports of him then, I mean, he's getting gold, paid in gold, he's putting all this money in British banks because he doesn't trust right now anything that's in the U.S. He is selling Confederate cotton to Stillman and to other people in the north, as well as to London and to France. When the Union forces actually take over Brownsville in the South Texas area, what does Francisco simply do? They simply move their little operation to Laredo and do the same thing coming down the Rio Grande, waving little Mexican flags when they could. And it was kind of funny when the Mexicans were going, it's a Mexican flag, we know what they're doing and that money's going to go to the French. They raise then the little American flag. I mean, it's kind of like this little like three different flags. And nobody Nobody's going to bother us. So Baghdad, Mexico, which is kind of the port they were using off Matamoros, became this town where they say millionaires were walking around. Well, interestingly enough, in 1866, a hurricane came and wiped out Baghdad. They said it was like Sodom and Gomorrah from all the money people were making during this time. But anyhow, the war ends. You all know how it ends. The Confederates lose. And Francisco's like, oh no, I've been on the wrong side. What are we going to do? Well, 1865, he puts all his interest in the United States in the name of his brother, Santiago. He is already getting ready for Reconstruction. So this is somebody that's like unprepared. And he was also assured through one of his good friends, Colonel Whitford, as well as Captain King and Captain Kennedy, that they were working on his pardon, and he'd probably get a pardon. The pardon took a while in coming. In the meantime, you have the French imperialist war in Mexico, and what ends up happening? 1867, the French lose. And Francisco's like, dear Lord, now I'm really kind of caught in the middle. So, in the meantime, he's waiting for this pardon from the U.S. government so that he can then go back to doing what he likes to do, business. But he's not getting it right away. So, on May 4th, he takes off. Well, it really wasn't, I like to call it a self-imposed exile, but it really is more like a grand tour of Europe. I have all this money, I'm going to go ahead and use it for a while. Ironically, his full pardon came on May 10th, so he missed it a few days. Anyhow, he actually takes off for a year in Europe, a grand life in Europe. He goes by way of Veracruz in Mexico, which was kind of like one of the last French bastions. From Veracruz goes to Cuba. From Cuba goes to New York and is actually in New York City for a while, which is kind of funny because he's waiting for his pardon and he's in New York City. But he's in New York City really because of a court case that will drag out until the 1880s. There was this case that this ex-Confederate said Francisco had sold his cotton, that had stolen the cotton and sold it, and so Francisco owed him money and had actually sued him in the ports of New York. So Francisco, this is like a long-going, something like a 20-year case where he's constantly either talking to New York City or going to New York City to figure out the case. In the end, he actually won the case. And it was very interesting. It was Stillman's descendants that actually helped him secure some really good lawyers in New York. So it's always really interesting to see those kind of things. He goes to Europe, has a great life. I've seen the bills of lading where he's like, you know, staying in hotels in Paris and he's just buying champagne and caviar. And I mean, they must have thought he was the king of Mexico or something. Upon his return, and I do want y'all to know that he's not forgotten business. He has been through letters, been very involved in what Santiago is doing and making sure that everything is good. When he returns, basically, he just goes back to the old mode. He makes sure that Santiago gives him the power of attorney back. He gets it back and goes back to what he likes to do, business. This is right the Gilded Age, right there. And what we're going to see him is he's going to invest in some very successful things and some very unsuccessful things. One of the first things he tries to do when he gets back is buy the old Mifflin, the King and Kennedy steamboat industry. He wanted to go into steamboats. Well, he kind of made a wrong turn there. The Rio Grande changed. And actually, Kennedy and King had already kind of left this business. They've come up here to the north where they are going to establish their ranches. He invests in schooners. Well, his schooners, the two that he buys, actually get, what do you call it when you hit a ground? Grounded, thank you. So he loses that, and he's like, not good. But what he really starts looking at is the cattle industry. And this is where we see him getting involved in the ranching industry. It's the cattle boom. And basically the cattle boom happens because of the Civil War, both armies had used up all the meat. They had used up actually all the pork, which was the beef, the type of meat they used first, and then they started going into beef. And the soldiers loved the beef so much, they wanted more beef. But in the East, they'd eaten up all the beef. And in Texas, we had all this beef. And so you see the beginning of what's going to be called the cattle boom. All we really need to do is drive up our cattle to the railheads and get them shipped off to Chicago, and we can make millions and millions of dollars selling cattle. Francisco is not going to be John Wayne, okay? He's not going to get on the horses and take off and do these John Chisholm type of trails. What he is going to do, though, is invest in cattle. And his cattle will join up with the King and the Kennedy ranches, and they will go up the Chisholm Trail, which, if you follow 77, I always tell my students, that's kind of the Chisholm Trail, in a way. And so he will be making money off of that. His headquarters will be a ranch, or his headquarters of the ranch will be Punta del Monte, which still exists in the Yturria family's hands. He will create the Yturria Cattle Company. He will put one of his relatives also in charge, and they will manage a lot of Punta del Monte and the Yturria Cattle Company. They will also deal with bandits, they will deal with Native American raids, and they do have Texas Rangers. Texas Rangers actually patrolled his ranch. You hear all these other stories where the Rangers were not patrolling some ranches. He's like, no, they're patrolling my ranch. And he took full advantage of that. But really one of his most lasting effects is going to be something that throughout the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, he did try various attempts to bring this down to Brownsville, and that is the railroad. Various attempts, he actually lost about $50,000 in one of the attempts, got conned in trying to bring down the railroad. But it isn't really until the 1900s, Colonel Uriah Lott, who is able to organize what will be called the St. Louis Brownsville, Mexico Railroad, pretty much following 77. And what you're going to end up seeing is that on the board of directors for it is going to be all the ranches that are going down 77, who had actively wanted a train to go down. And so what you're seeing is you have the Sarita station over there on the Kennedy Ranch. You had, well, Kingsville and all that. But then you also have the Yturria train station. And what's really interesting is along with 77 is that Francisco, again, thinking, you never know what's going to happen in the future. And he actually started planning a little town, the Yturria town site, where he had his cattle pens for the Yturria station. So he's thinking, like, someday this might end up being a town and I can make a lot of money being a kind of this land baron, railroad baron. But really, when you look at overall history of the railroad, how important that was to the Rio Grande. It'll finally arrive in Brownsville, Texas, July 4th. It was met with a lot of fanfare on July 4th, 1904. It was a very, very big deal. The valley was forever changed. Like I said earlier, it became agriculture, it became open. Really, it had been isolated. That wild horse desert that had kind of isolated the valley, it was open. It was now kind of connected. Francisco's getting older now in his 1900s. He is having trouble with circulation in his legs. He was a little on the chubby side. He liked his food. But he's still going every day to work, still managing things, still wanting to make money. And it's really interesting as he gets older. He's looking for new ways of making money. And this is one story. And again, as a historian, you hear family stories and you're like, I don't know if they're true or not. And then you have to back it up with documentation. And most of the time, the family's like, well, we don't have documentation. When I would talk to Frank Yturria, my uncle, and I would say, I need documentation. You can't give me just the story. I need the actual stuff. But this is a really interesting story, and it says a lot about his personality. He's already later in life, it's around 1905, 1906, and he realizes a new way he can make money. He's going to start hoarding silver and selling it. In the valley, or particularly in Mexico, the peso was one of the few coins that had actually was still being made with 100% pure silver. And what had happened is through trade and stuff, a lot of these peso coins were actually going to China, and for whatever reason, when they would come back from China, I'm not an economics historian, so don't question me as to how this whole thing happened, but when they would come back from China, they would get a mark. They had this kind of red mark on it, and for whatever reason, the population did not want to use the pesos because they were like marked, and I guess they thought they were bad. And Francisco's like, they're full silver. They're 100% silver. So he started paying little kids in Brownsville a penny to go out, scour all of Brownsville, and if they could go over to Matamoros, do it, because he was like, I'll pay you a penny for every peso you bring. And the kids were like, what a stupid old man. Francisco's like, yeah, I'm laughing my way all the way to the bank here. That's how ignorant I am. I know exactly what I'm doing. He's selling silver. He's melting down these coins into bars and selling them off. And again, making a very good profit. When he dies, it makes the local newspaper headlines. It makes a lot of various headlines throughout other places like the Corpus Christi papers and other places. Maybe not the headlines that are in Brownsville. But he was somebody that at the time people realized this is one of these last legends of South Texas. Someone that had changed South Texas. For good or for bad, but he had changed it. And what always brought me again to Francisco was the fact that he wasn't researched the same way that King and Kennedy were researched. In many ways, you would see in a lot of history papers, they would say all kinds of stuff about him. They would misspell his name. And by the way, it is Yturria, or Yturria, Y-T-U-R-R-I-A. It's been pronounced so many different ways. Francisco probably wouldn't have cared as long as you did business with him. But he is someone that had a great respect. We don't give these titles of don, which is in Spanish, titles of great respect, to people just half-heartedly. There are people that have accomplished something, that have done something, that have been something. And whether you're the foreman for a ranch that you've been there for 50-something years, and you'll hear the young guys go, don, whatever, of that ranch, or you're a great businessman like Francisco, that name, don, shows the great respect that not only the family had for him, but the community. He really was the patriarch for our family, but also the patriarch for Brownsville and Matamoros, because he intertwined so much of it. In Matamoros, he gave $80,000 to basically help fund the Teatro de la Reforma, which is considered one of the masterpieces of opera house in northern Mexico. In Brownsville, he contributed greatly to the Immaculate Conception Cathedral. When you go to the Brownsville areas, the Matamoros areas, to these areas of South Texas, you drive down South Texas in 77, you see his legacy. And that's what makes him very, very unique. And that's any questions? Are you having a test now?
As you leave Raymondville and driving this way,
yes, sir.
the Yturria Ranch is there on the right.
Yes.
Who is the owners and descendants of that?
Well, there was, it fell down, but, so I probably should have touched a little bit more. Francisco had 2 children. They were both adopted. Unfortunately, Francisco and his wife did not have biological children. So he he adopted 3 children. He adopted a little boy named Santiago who died. And he then went back to the family where he'd gotten little Santiago, and he found little Daniel, or Daniel. So Daniel is his son, Daniel Yturria. He, 17 years later, will adopt Isabel Yturria, and Isabel was actually a distant relative of his wife. And so eventually what ends up happening is Daniel Yturria being the man, that's the Yturria name, but Isabel Yturria marries a man by the name of Miguel Garcia. And so she is Isabel Yturria de Garcia. But on the Yturria side, Daniel will have 3 children. The oldest will die, and he will end up with 2 sons, and that is, I believe, Fausto and Herminio. And then Fausto will have 3 children, 2 boys, which is Frank Yturria, who also was a Texas Historical Commissioner, and Fausto Yturria. And so that is kind of, I know you asked me earlier about Fausto, that's kind of that branch going down there.
So who's on the ranch now?
Oh, on that ranch. I should listen better, worse than my students. So that is, so F. Yturria Ranch on the east side of 77 is Frank Yturria's descendants. He recently passed away, but it would be his children, his heirs. So that is F. Yturria. If you also look down on 77, you're going to see it divided because there's F. Yturria, but then there's also H. Yturria. H. Yturria is the other Herminio's descendants. So it's been divided. And then you'll have another Hacienda Yturria, which is another part of, it's Fausto Yturria's lands, Fausto and his sister. And then on the Garcia side, Isabel had 4 children. Juan Antonio, I need to, I know I'm blanking out, and I know these by heart, I'm so sorry. It's Juan Antonio, Miguel Alejandro, no, Miguel first, Juan Antonio, and Maria del Refugio, and my dad. Rosario. No, it's Rosario? I thought it was Rosario. Okay, Maria del Rosario. And Martin.
And Martin's her.
Martin is my dad's father. So I don't know, I just probably didn't do more than
West side.
Yes, so when things were divided up between Isabel and her brother Daniel, the east part of the Yturria ranch holdings went to Yturria, the name, because of Daniel, and then the west side of the railroad went to the Garcia branch. But there are many other land holdings throughout the counties where you still actually have Garcia, Yturria, well, a few that are still together, but most of the lands have been divided between Yturria and Garcia. But they're going to be right next to each other because it's basically the same family, just two branches. And yes, ma'am.
Is there a homestead that has a historical marker? A couple of years, well, maybe, I don't know how long, 15 years ago, I'm from Dallas, and the State Fair had an exhibit of all ranches or homesteads that had been in the same family for at least 100 years.
Well, actually, what's really interesting, and I probably should have mentioned it, is when Francisco died, his will was really interesting. He did not leave anything to his children. He did not leave anything to Daniel or Isabel. He left it to his grandchildren. And the reason he did this is he's trying to consolidate, keep the lands together longer. So what ended up happening, eventually, things didn't quite get partitioned the way he had hoped. But what you ended up seeing is that the 4 Garcia siblings and the 2 Yturria siblings, both of them and their ranches all pretty much got listed eventually in the 100, they've been in 100, I forgot, it's the peerage, Texas peerage, 100, the lands have been in the family for over 150 years. That generation has had other siblings, and, not other siblings, other descendants. So, things sometimes get watered down a bit, but yes, some of these lands have been over now 200 and something years in the family. The old headquarters of Francisco Yturria, which is Punta del Monte, that was his actual headquarters. He never lived there. He never saw this as, he was not a rancher, he saw it as a business. In fact, he actually thought about selling them, the ranches at different times. But Punta del Monte is actually in the H. Yturria branch of the family. So that is still in one of the family's names. I don't believe they have a Texas historical marker on it, but they do. They do have, okay. I don't think they do. Family squabbling. But no, so Francisco's house actually in Brownsville, that got raised down many, many years ago. So there is no homestead of Francisco. If anything, there's homesteads that go back really to the grandchildren's level, to them actually being on their ranches and having those homes. So no, not Francisco.
When we were in Brownsville the other day, Vicki and Greg and I drove on Elizabeth Street where it has the Yturria Bank plaque.
Yeah, the Yturria building is still there, and it does have the national marks, which probably for Francisco is even better than a house. Because he would prefer to remember his business and not whatever, my house, I don't care, but remember the business. Yes?
Was he involved in the railroad other than as an investor? Was he involved in the construction or management?
No, he was on the board of directors, but he was not, I don't think he actually participated in some kind of detailed way that like Uriah Lab would have been involved. I know as board of directors, they all invested a great amount of money to bring it down, and then they were allowed to create those town sites, those different stations along the way, but actually involved in the actual managing of the railroad or any of the construction, no. He probably would have just said, I do want it to go through my land, but other than that, no. Not that I know of, I mean, unless something else happened. Any other questions?
He had his own private car.
Oh, yes, I forgot to mention, this is family lore, but I actually have been able to back it up. Francisco was able to get his own railroad car, and so he would hook it up in Brownsville and like take off to New Orleans and New York. And I mean, this is the late 1800s, well, early 1900s with the railroad. He lived a very grand lifestyle. Very much when you hear about the Rockefellers and the Carnegies at that era were a very low cost of living. He's living in Brownsville, so you can imagine the low cost of living in Brownsville. But he is very much living a very grand lifestyle. I mean, he hooks up his railroad, goes wherever he wants. And probably in his older age, from some of the letters I got, you see him becoming a little more, I'm Francisco, you know, I'm Don Francisco. But rightly so, he had worked very, very hard for a lot of what he did. And I mean, I know as a child, I was always like, he was a smuggler. It's like, no, that's not, you don't need to focus on that, focus on the other stuff. And he's like, he didn't smuggle like that. Well, I'm talking about, oh, you all know what it is. And we'll go there. Yes, ma'am.
How old was he when that picture was taken?
This is actually later in life, and I meant to bring a younger photo. Unfortunately, I didn't get it large enough. He was in this area. He was known for his very voluptuous mustache. He was already close. He was about maybe 4 or 5 years before he passed away. So he was already much older. But I mean, black and white photography makes you look quite young.
He doesn't look that big. I mean,
He was about, from what I understand, well, no, I mean, he wasn't, I mean, he was towards his later life. He, I believe, was about 5'7" in height. He wasn't a very tall man, about 5'7", 5'8". Not, actually, maybe more like 5'7". I read somewhere that he was 5'6". I don't know, so I'll give him the extra inch. But he wasn't a very tall man. And he was also known for very simple clothing. He loved a black smock coat, and he loved horse race buggies. Some of his pastimes, he liked to do stuff like that.
Yes, you mentioned the rangers protected
Yes,
these ranches.
At
where
times,
it
yes,
appears
ma'am.
other ranches weren't. Is there any indication he paid them off, or that was why?
Good question. Probably. Well, I mean, that's what I'm saying. Francisco's life is so different from a lot of the typical norms of the time. And I think partly because he never looked at things like, I'm this ethnicity, it's about business and money and whatever. So for him, when he's getting, you know, cattle is being stolen, and I mean, that's the other thing, they weren't fenced. These ranches weren't fenced in. I don't think they fenced Punta del Monte until 1880s, 1890s. And so when you're losing money, like you're losing money to bandits or Native American raids or, you know, Mexican raids or even Anglo-American bandits, it doesn't, like, I don't care, he's like, I don't care who it is, they're stealing. And so the idea of having the Rangers, which had actually looked over King and Kennedy, and he's friends with these guys, he would have been very, very accepting of the Rangers coming in. Now, does it mean that he doesn't hear a lot of what happened to these early Rangers and their stories? I'm sure he did. I'm sure he did. But on his part, for him, they're taking care of business or helping him in some way. All good?